Welcome to the Women in Wellness podcast. This is your place to get the latest up-to-date health and wellness information specifically for women, while providing you practical tools you can implement today. I'm Dr. Caitlin Sazowski, and I wanted to personally thank you for spending part of your day with me. Hello, Women in Wellness Tribe. I have a very special guest with me today, and we're going to talk about something that I've talked about many times in the past, but she is an expert in methylation. So we are going to be talking all things methylation and why that's important to you. What is methylation? And I'm sure you guys remember from past conversations that we absolutely need to be healthy methylators, but what makes us a healthy methylator? What does methylation do? And what could methylation cause? So with me today, I have Dr. Kendra Becker, who is a nurse practitioner. She's an ND, she's a professor, but she really focuses on the whole person when she's working with them. So although she may be looking into genes and genetics, can you please tell us what you told me about how genes aren't our be-all, end-all? I loved it. It was so perfect. And thank you for being with me.
Oh, anytime. Thanks for having me. So I always say our genes do not define us, that our epigenetics or our environment are far more important. And I always tell the story about my 96-year-old grandmother, God rest her soul, who graduated from high school at the same weight that she died at. She walked every day, and any medicine she needed, she found in her backyard, in her garden. And so I always look at that as a very glaring example, because before her death, I was able to look at her genetics. And she's Italian. She was an Italian immigrant. And as we all know, with regard to MTHFR, almost 100% of the Italian Mediterranean population carries 2 copies of the C677T mutation, which she did. And, she had a whole bunch of other inflammation markers that if I had just looked at her, at the paper and not at her, I would have never thought that she would have been able to live to 96 and have all of the teeth in her mouth and read books and paint pictures, up until the very, very end of her life. So there.
Yeah. Say that, as most people would look at her and be like, oh, she has to have good genes. She's got to have really good genes in order to, be 96, have all her teeth, be able to walk, be cognitively there. And that was not the case.
Right. Absolutely. And my mom too. My mom also has the same 2 copies of C677T. She's in her 70s. She's very spry. She still has the softest skin, which we always attribute to the olive oil. And, she, again, knock on wood, doesn't have any health problems. So genes do not define us, for sure.
I love it. I always use the analogy, genes load our gun, but our lifestyle environment will pull the trigger. So just because we have a loaded gun, if we don't pull the trigger, there's going to be no damage. There's going to be no long-term consequences. It's what we do that pulls the trigger that causes all of the harm, the repercussions, and the frustration. So,
you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Oh, I love talking to people when they think I'm right. No, I'm kidding. I actually love when I'm taught something a little different too. So why don't you talk about what is methylation? Because there's a lot of definitions being thrown around out there. There's a lot of people talking about methylation, especially with the new ability for people to just go and swab their cheek and send it in to see what type of MTHFR gene mutation, if they have, if they're homozygous, heterozygous, how many copies, and then they don't know what it means and they don't even know what to do with it.
Right. So the easiest definition of methylation, in my opinion, is that it's a component of the detox pathway. If it is impaired in some way, 10%, 50%, 90%, you have that level of impairment in your body's ability to eliminate toxins or eliminate things that the body is unable to digest, assimilate, and utilize. And so that's literally how I describe it to my patients. I think really kind of breaking it down, because as you know, if you have a patient that struggles with methylation, one of the first and key signs of it is brain fog. So trust me, I love biochemistry. In fact, I just had a conversation with a girlfriend of mine, and she was like, "Oh, chemistry is I was always the last one done in my class." And I was like, "Not me. I still look at fondness of my organic chemistry teacher and some of the lectures he gave from like 20 years ago." So, but that's the easiest way to describe it. You know, that we could certainly get into nuances about the utilization of B vitamins and magnesium and some of the cofactors. But really, I think the most important takeaway here is you want your body to get the bad stuff out and keep the good stuff in. And that's ultimately what I think is the take home message here for patients. And it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And I truly believe, I was reading a study not too long, well, it's probably over 6 months ago now. They believe that, excuse me, over 90% of the general population now have some form of methylation issue. And so the likelihood of you only having a 10% disturbance in your methylation is pretty low. They're thinking more on the lines of 50 to 90% is where we're sitting. And so why do you think that is? Like, why do you think that so many people are having such a hard time with methylating now, given the day and age that we live in?
So this is one of my most favorite conversations to have, and largely because, you know, I'm descended from Italian immigrants, and we know for generations that Italians have always had 2 copies of C677T. There is some research showing that it can be preservative to some diseases, but again, our genes do not define us. And so if our genes do not define us, you can have as many crappy genes as your body can tolerate, and you just don't upregulate or downregulate them, meaning that your genes don't get turned on as a protective mechanism. I believe that every gene we have has an ability to protect our body in that pathway that it codes for. I think it's the same with methylation. You know, and another good example is when you look at the Mexican population, they're also almost 100% of the population is positive for 2 copies of C677T. We know that those methylation defects cause problems with midlines. And what do we see in Mexican populations in an overwhelming percentage is cleft lip and palate, right? The development during embryonic development causes problems with the cleft lip and palate. So again, is it a genetic problem? I don't think so. I used to actually go and do cleft lip and palate surgery in the good old days when you could cross borders in other countries with relative ease and just go in and work with the Red Cross. But when you looked at the populations that actually came in with the cleft lip and palates, they were very, very poor. They were getting subsidized food from the government. They were eating GMO corn. They were getting all kinds of untested pharmaceutical medications. And so you have to look at the exposure, their environmental exposure to all of these toxins, and wonder if that's what was causing the upregulation of genes. In Italy, same population, same subset, same genetic makeup, but what do you see in Italy? Everybody shops at the farmer's market 2 to 3 times a week. Everybody walks around. Everybody drinks red wine that isn't full of glyphosate and added sulfates. So, I mean, I think that's a really amazing, you know, kind of social study to look at those 2 different populations simply because their genetics are similar, but the epigenetics are very, very different. That's
completely fascinating that you brought up, you know, embryonic development, because that's something that we can see immediately in the terms of, you know, a few months after gestation. Right. But the fact that we're passing those on to our kids, and anything that we're exposed to, majority of those toxins have an affinity for the placenta. They want to pass that placental barrier because for whatever reason, the baby's tissues are far more attractive than the mother's. And that goes with everything from mercury from silver fillings to glyphosate to, you know, lead in our pipes. It just soaks up in that baby, and that baby's detoxification system is not set up to handle that type of load. So what are some other things that, when we were talking about methylation, like you brought up fertility, mm-hmm. How does methylation hinder fertility, or how does it affect fertility?
So I can tell you a personal story on that regard. I have 2 children that are 14 and 11. And prior to my daughter being born, I had 2 late stage miscarriages. They were both at 14 weeks. So, I mean, talk about having something really mentally play with your head. That was a really interesting and challenging time for me. So now let's kind of go back. We know now methylfolate is the bioavailable folate, but this was 15, 16, 17 years ago, where even naturopaths were saying, oh, give everybody tons of folic acid, before we really had appropriate definitions of the difference between the synthetic folic acid and the bioavailable methylfolate. So I was in my 30s. I thought I was doing a good thing. I was taking 5 milligrams of folic acid, which when I think about now, like it literally almost makes me gag. So with these pregnancies, because I was going to do everything right, and I quit drinking coffee, which we can talk about that in another podcast, but I can assure you when I got pregnant with my daughter, I didn't do that. And so what happened in my case is I'm compound heterozygous. I have one copy of C677T and one copy of 1298C. Because I was taking all of that folic acid and I have a methylation impairment, that synthetic folic acid was gumming up my receptors. And those receptors kind of look like champagne glasses. So the folic acid was sitting in the champagne glass. And because of that, because folate, B12, B6, magnesium, zinc, and a whole host of other minerals are cofactors for all of this embryonic development, what was physically happening in my body was I would get the cell signals and the gene codes at 4 weeks to do what it was supposed to do at 6 weeks. And then at 6 weeks as to what to do at 8 weeks. But because my receptors were so gummed up and jammed, eventually I lost the cell signaling, my baby stopped growing, and I lost those 2 pregnancies. So literally what happened to me, I swear, was an act of God. I'll never forget it. I got an email from a company that said, oh, yeah, we kind of realized folic acid is bad. We're switching to methylfolate in all of our supplements. Change, love, forgive, and peace. And I sat there and I read the email, and it was like a nothing email. You know, you get stuff like that from supplement companies all the time. And it was like all of a sudden this light bulb went off, and I tested myself for MTHFR that day. I switched to a prenatal that I designed, that I still use to this day, and had a healthy baby at 40 weeks. Excuse me, she was born the day before her due date. 3 years later, almost to the day, I had another healthy baby who was born on his due date. And in my case, it was as simple as once I cleaned out those receptors, and once I was able to methylate past where, you know, the bottleneck was in the embryonic development of my babies, my system worked fine. And that's, just a testament to the fact that I was a perfectly healthy person. I didn't have any, diagnoses for any chronic illnesses. I never really had any, health challenges that required long periods of recovery. There was nothing about me that I would have at that point, bless you, I would have at that point ever tested me or a patient like me for any kind of genetic problems. And so because of my experience, I was like, well, there's my aha moment. And so went forward from there. So it can absolutely happen.
Isn't it crazy how the struggles that we go through at the time, they seem unsurmountable and unfair and what the hell, they become our biggest and best teachers. And that's really what allows us to move forward and really share our experience with others so that they can avoid getting into the same trap that we got in.
For sure.
Like I was telling you, I haven't tested the MTHFR because honestly, the way that I look at it is pretty sure I have it. Don't know what type, doesn't matter. But I don't care because it's not going to dictate the health of my well-being because of all of the other options that I can choose, meaning lifestyle, meaning, supplements, like using methylated supplements, all of those things. So, with that being said, though, can methylation cause women to struggle getting pregnant, or can methylation issues cause problems with their sex hormones? So whether it be irregular periods, whether it be going into perimenopause early, whether it be having horrible postmenopausal symptoms, can that be tied back into their ability or inability to methylate?
All of it, of course, because when you think about exactly what methylation does, right, it's a component of the detox pathway. If you have too much toxicity in your body, it sets off a cell danger response, a cytokine storm, an immune upregulation, depending on what level of toxicity you're at. So clearly having those cell signals, the body is going to think that your organism is in harm's way. So I always describe it to my patients as you're the cave girl running from the dinosaur. So if you're the cave girl running from the dinosaur, the last thing that you should be doing is procreating, because how are you going to, take this other person with you as you run from a dinosaur? And so absolutely. So, I mean, really the problem with methylation, and I think for somebody like me who's been doing this for well over 15 years, it's more than just the one gene. And so you and I kind of talked about that. There's lots of doctors who are like, oh, you're MTHFR positive, you're a mutant, take some of this vitamin and you'll be fine. And that's not always the answer. And so if there is a bottleneck or, a stick in your cogwheel, there's going to be a problem with your detox pathways. And there's going to be a problem with all the things that you just mentioned, getting pregnant, staying pregnant, early menopause, perimenopause, all of it, because it really is just a toxic burden. And, as naturopaths or as holistic providers, we look at disease as being a toxic burden of any kind. So if you can remove the toxicity, if you can remove the obstacle to cure by supporting methylation appropriately or biohacking your genes or whatever it is, then ultimately the body always, always, always returns to homeostasis.
So what would you recommend for the Women in Wellness listeners who are like, you know what, I either pretty sure I have an MTHFR mutation like myself based on Dutch test and certain lab markers and things like that, or they have gotten tested and they do indeed have a mutation in their methylation genes. What should they be doing then in order to downregulate the complications that can arise from having those genetic SNPs?
So, of course, treatment is very, very individualized because, as you know, people that in some cases that are positive for MTHFR don't tolerate things like methyl donors. So they can't even tolerate B12, which is required by metabolic production in every cell, or they don't tolerate high dose methylfolate, which again is kind of food for the nucleus of the cell. So I would say,
how would they know that they don't tolerate it? What would be some signs?
You feel bad. Sometimes you get headaches, sometimes you get brain fog. I've heard patients report, symptoms of vertigo, GI symptoms. I mean, it's different depending on, again, where your kind of backlog is or where your toxic burden kind of lies. But I think in general, I mean, that's the beauty of naturopathic medicine. Just live like a naturopath, right? So turn off your Wi-Fi. I always say, these are my advice to everybody. Eat clean, make sure your diet's really clean, whatever that means for you. In my house, I follow a paleo diet. We generally get grass-fed beef from a local farm. We grow a lot of our own vegetables. I have chickens for pastured eggs and things like that, minimal sugar, processed foods and things like that. Train mean, exercise, to whatever your capacity is. So I often recommend chair yoga or chair stretches to patients who haven't exercised in years. I also have patients that run ultra marathons. So whatever the exercise is, then I say practice forgiveness, because we all know hate and anger. Number one, it gives you a ton of back pain. Number two, it wrecks your adrenals, and it certainly affects your sleep, and it can affect other relationships. And so I think, practicing forgiveness is another thing. And then the fourth thing I always say is connect with your creator. And, I tend to be pretty faithful. People have all kinds of relationships with all kinds of higher powers, but that is in one way something that very much grounds us. And we in our human bodies have a pineal gland, which is deep, deep in the middle of our skull, which is protected by the brain, which is protected by the skull and the muscles and the hair and everything else. And that is how we connect with our creator. And we know that things like fluoride and Wi-Fi and toxic things like glyphosate all affect that pineal gland and that connection that you have with your higher power. So that's basically my advice for everybody. clinic. So my big joke is I have a pretty decent waiting list. It's a couple months long. And I say these poor patients, they wait 4 months for me to give them those 4 pieces of advice, probiotics and a fish oil and a lab slip. And then they don't see me again for 4 months. But I think we've gotten so far away from that. We're in such a medicalized society, and all of these pharmaceutical companies, these drugs, these things that people rub all over their skin can affect your body's ability to detox. And if we don't make a conscious effort to look at that on a daily basis, you're going to show up in my office with terrible symptoms of menopause or insomnia or your hair falling out or things like that we all struggle with when we get a little older.
Oh, so crazy when you look back and you're like, oh man, like that was not smart. So
yeah,
like for me, the dentist when I was 16, I had great teeth, no cavities, put sealants on all of my teeth. Full of plastic, guys. Sealants in dental stuff, no good, just like filling material. So silver fillings by far the worst, but white fillings still have plastic. And knowing what I know now, I'm like, well, that's definitely clogging my receptors because of all the plastic. So knowing sometimes there's things that you can't do, because there's no way to know whether all of the sealant was removed when I found my holistic dentist. You don't know if you can get it all off because it's clear. But supporting the methylation part, supporting the detox pathways is something that I'm just going to have to do the rest of my life. And, you know, when you know that, it's empowering. It's not like, it doesn't mush you down. It doesn't make you, or it doesn't make me feel bad. It's just like, okay, that's something that I have to do because of what had happened in the past. So when you say glyphosate, I think most people understand glyphosate now, but what is it specifically that people are avoiding with glyphosate and why?
So glyphosate is a well-known herbicide. The problem is they sell it in big, beautiful pyramids at your local big box store for you to spray all over your green grass so that it kills weeds. But the bigger problem is that it's also sprayed on crops that are fed to some of the animals that are commercially farmed. So when you are what you eat, just like those little Saturday morning commercials. And so the problem with glyphosate is that it's a well-known hormone disruptor. It causes cancer, and that's been, reported in multiple class action lawsuits. And it's pervasive in our society. It's in our water supply. It's on our lawns. It's in our food. So,
in our wine.
In our wine, yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, in our wine, even in the organic wine. I mean, all of it. So the biggest problem is that it's everywhere. The easiest way to avoid it is to try to consume as much local organic produce as you can. For me, I know my farmer by name. We've known them for 10 years. I know what she feeds the cows. I can go up and be like, oh, that'll be dinner in about 18 months. And it's a very different relationship than buying commercial raised beef that's been, basically stressed their whole life, pumped full of hormones, and then of course fed all of these grains that are loaded with glyphosate. So
I love what you said. You are what you eat. I always add, you are what you eats, meaning if you're going to be eating animals, you have to be mindful of what they're being fed, because whatever they're eating is getting into their tissues. And when you eat that tissue, you're getting all of that in. So that's why I stress the importance of quality protein when you eat it. So wild caught, grass-fed, pasture-raised, organic, hormone-free, all so important, not to mention the sheer amount of vitamins you get from them compared to the conventionally grown animals is, you can't compare it. You can't compare it. And what I would love to see at some point, because I have yet, and maybe there's a lot of people who are like, well, animal meat causes your saturated fats to go through the roof, which causes cardiovascular disease and blah, blah, blah. All of those studies are done on conventionally raised animals. What's happening with the grass-fed, pasture-raised, like literally the happy animals that are living their best life until they're taken to, become food on our table. So have you seen studies that show the difference, or?
So interesting. You'll appreciate this. So I was in my office and I had like 30 minutes between patients, which is really unusual. So I opened up a cabinet that had all my old books in it, like from naturopathic school. And I was in a throwing away mood. I was going to throw away books because we don't need them anymore. And I started to look at the books in there and the notes that I took from class and things like that. And I said to my husband, I was like, I can't throw away a single thing because I feel like I have a banned book library. I mean, the stuff that they taught us in school 15 years ago, really before there was a huge switch and, this kind of medical bullying that's now become really the norm in our society. But I do remember, and I wonder if I have it in my archives, I'll check for you, but I do remember very clearly in a naturopathic philosophy class, 20 years ago, that there was a study that was done on grass-fed beef versus commercial beef. And they showed in that study that there was the same level of omega-3 in the grass-fed beef that there was in the wild-caught salmon, which was not the case in the commercially raised beef. So I know that the studies did exist. I mean, these days censorship is just so rampant. So if I have a paper copy, I'll definitely pass it along, but I know those studies absolutely did exist.
Isn't that crazy? I was going to say, you can assume when you understand nutrition and how our bodies make the nutrients from the food we eat, that would make sense, that grass-fed would have a very high amount of omega-3s compared to the conventional, because conventionally raised animals, they're fed corn and grains, and that's not what they were like made to digest in the first place. So assuming if we feed them the stuff to fatten them up, which by the way, if that's what we're using to fatten up our livestock, what do you think is going to happen to us when we consume large quantities of it? That they would be healthy. So
absolutely. I've had that conversation with my husband and with my kids, simply that the reason that we see marbling in steak is because they're corn finished, and the corn is so inflammatory that it actually causes atherosclerosis in the cow.
And we eat it.
And it tastes kind of good. I'm not going to lie. But
don't get me wrong.
Grass-fed.
I was going to say, I'm very much like you. I was back in Manitoba this summer, and it's hard finding clean organic food in Canada. I don't know what the deal is. Canada, come on, get into the 21st century here. But I found myself a local farmer at the farmer's market. Her and I became besties, but the amount of food, like the amount of beef that you actually need to eat when you're eating high quality, is far less, because you actually get fuller faster. What do you tell people when they're like starting to make shifts and changes, like whether it's grass-fed meat, saying like, oh, it doesn't taste right, it's tough, it's not the same, I like my conventional better because it's a lot leaner, or the taste of organic wines from Italy or France don't taste right compared to Napa Valley, or whatever it may be? What do you tell your clients?
So after I turned 40, I kind of lost that gentle nudge that I used to give my patients. And now I'm like, basically, it is what it is. And you pay now or you pay later. And you get used to everything. And then I talk a lot about the palate, because chemicals, processed foods, fake sugars, even real sugar for that matter, actually clouds the palate. It causes a histamine reaction on the tongue, and that becomes like normal to that body. So you only feel satisfied or desire foods that cause that histamine reaction. Grass-fed beef, which is less inflammatory than commercial beef, or GMO foods, which are, clearly inflammatory to the body, cause a way higher reaction than non-GMO foods, is something that you have to kind of get used to over time. So generally, I tend to be a little bit permissive with my patients. And I'm like, listen, switch from your Ilio's pizza to, an organic pizza. Then you can go to the gluten-free pizza. Then you can go to the grain-free pizza. And it becomes kind of like a deliberate but empowering kind of experience for them. Because you know better than anybody, when you have somebody who's chronically ill, I wrote 2 cookbooks. I love to tell people what to eat, but when they come into the office and they feel so bad and they've already been to 7 doctors who have thrown their hands up at them, now you're like, okay, you need to be on this very strict diet. You need to eat 8 times a day. You need to prepare your own food. You need to make bone broth. You need to, do all these exercises. People are going to be like, forget it, I'll take the pill. So you have to allow patients to really progress on their own trajectory. And if they look at me and they're like really overwhelmed, then I usually say, start with one thing that's like the most inflammatory, like take the gluten out or take all the corn out. And then from there, I see them in a month or whatever their next visit is scheduled for, and then they make the progress and they feel that much better. So it gives them that kind of ammunition to want to step to the next level.
Oh, so you're nicer than me.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Oh man, when people are working with me, I'm like, look, you've been dealing with this for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yep.
Let's jump into the deep end with me. 30 days. Let's take out all the crap. I'll give you the recipes. You'll feel better, and we'll slowly add certain things back in.
Yeah.
But they feel really, really good in 30 days. So they're like, okay, great. I don't have to actually go back and, do the breads from the gluten or whatever it may be, but it's because they just went all in with me. So it's not for everybody. I tell people, look, you got to be prepared and you got to be ready to do this. I'll help you. I'll make it as easy as I can, but you're in the position you're in for a reason, and we got to get you out of it.
Yeah. I always tell, you'll appreciate this story. We're paleo, so I don't eat a lot of sugar. I don't eat a lot of high glycemic foods at all. Mm-hmm. A couple of Christmases ago, and I love Nutella, right? I love like a chocolate hazelnut spread. I have a recipe in one of my cookbooks. It's definitely something that's worth consuming on a regular basis. I don't know what happened this particular Christmas is a couple of years ago. And I ended up switching from my homemade Nutella to the organic Nutella, which is a lot higher sugar. And it became something that I was eating like on a regular basis. So I wake up one morning and I turned to my husband. I was like, that's it. I got to go on a sugar detox. I don't know how it got back into my diet, but it did. So my husband's like, okay. Cause I do this to him like fairly regularly. So he's like, whatever. So I decided to go cold turkey, like you recommend to your patients. And I think I'm like 8 hours in and I'm like having the sugar sweats. And I'm thinking like, how did I get here? Like, I know better. I know this is something that my body doesn't tolerate, but yet here I am. And sugar in particular takes like 3 days. So I think that's one of the reasons why I tend to be a little bit more permissive. I have taken the hard line with patients, and I'm always astonished when people come back 30 days later and they're like, yep, did everything you said, lost 8 pounds, reversed my ANA, my vitamin D went up, and all my inflammation markers went down. And I'm like, oh, see, I'm a healer, but that can be hard for some people.
Yep. So women, for you listening,
see,
there's a lot of other support that goes into just taking it all out. It's not going
right. Sure.
It is supporting the detoxification, because guess what? When you start to remove all of those things, your body's like, oh, sweet, I can start to do some of the things that I couldn't do before because I was so bogged down. But you got to make sure your detox pathways are open, especially when it comes to methylation. So, what would make people, because I'd like to go back to like methylation and like some symptoms, what would make somebody think that they may have a methylation problem, or methylation should be something they're addressing?
So in my office, the scenarios are very similar. I usually hear, I had surgery, I had a flu shot, I got into a car accident, some sort of event. And since then I've had brain fog, or I've had joint pain, or I've had a weird rash, or I can't tolerate garlic. It's usually some sort of a direct cause and effect. The other thing is I see a lot of fertility patients who, think they've done everything right. And they come in the office and they say, I've done this, this, and this, and I'm still not able to get pregnant. I got worked up by a fertility doctor. They told me I have no eggs. I have no this, I have no that, whatever the standard jam is. And they want me to go on all these hormones to balance this. So I think that first of all, I think it's always intuition is a good place to start. But I think if you have a health problem that tends to have not so much of a name or a face, but something that can affect you on some level, it's probably a methylation issue. And it's, again, because you're looking at the foundation. So if you have a crack in your foundation and you build a pyramid on top of it, you're going to have a beautiful pyramid probably for a good amount of time. But if a wind comes or somebody kicks the foundation or there's a flood or whatever, that's when you start to see the crumbling. And that's kind of how I look at methylation. Is it's one component of a multifaceted, a very, very complex, very important pathway. But it can be something that creates a huge problem when you look at the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it. It's one of those things where people are like, I can tell you exactly when this started. It started, like you said, after a car accident or after a divorce or after the birth of a child or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
It's a stressful situation that triggers it.
Correct.
And so what do they do after that stressful situation? So I know you mentioned like changing the food, so removing a lot of the chemicals within the food. Mm-hmm. So everybody, you guys hear me talk about diet diversity all the time. There's no one diet that I think everybody needs to follow because everybody needs different requirements at different times, especially menstruating women. Mm-hmm. We need to support our hormones. So going low carb, going keto the entire month, that's going to cause long-term problems with your menstruation, with your progesterone production, which could throw you into early perimenopause or menopause. You don't want to go down that road. So making sure that you're varying the styles of eating, but keeping certain maybe parameters like I do within the food. So you said you follow a pretty like paleo lifestyle kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Why do you choose paleo? What is like your reason for paleo?
So for me personally, I don't tolerate grains well. I find that, and it's really funny. And then the older I get and the better I get to know my body, there are things that are allowed on paleo that I also don't tolerate. Mm-hmm. So for me, I usually get, if I eat something that I shouldn't with regard to grains, I feel achy joints in my wrist. I really feel like the lectins and the phytates just don't go real well in my GI system. So that's kind of what we followed. It's an easy diet. We're social, so we eat out in restaurants fairly regularly. So it's an easy diet to follow when you're out in restaurants. It's an easy diet to raise kids on, even though I'm not strict with my kids with regard to that. But, the bulk of their diet is fruits, vegetables, and protein. They can have grains if they want them. We have them in the house, but it's not something my husband and I eat. But I, like you, I don't believe anything is an all or nothing. And I think as women in particular, we need to really dial in and listen to our bodies. But the rules that I always follow and that I do recommend for my patients is lean, clean protein, diversity. And then the other thing I learned years ago was 25 different plants a week, a week. So, and then that keeps your microbiome as diverse as it can be. And it helps reduce your risk of the ability to make and manufacture disease. So we have those conversations at the dinner table. Okay, there are 5 different vegetables in our salad tonight. Tomorrow we're going to have broccoli. Maybe we need to add some herbs on Thursday, that kind of a thing, so that we can make sure that you get that microbiome diversity. And other than that, that's really as complicated as I make it for patients, again, because you want people to get better, and you want them to get better on the most direct path to their healing. So, I mean, I love the physiology of like an anti-inflammatory diet, but it is so complicated for people. Or the steps in a GAPS diet they're beautiful. And it's, I mean, I've seen so much reversal with regard to autism with people that are really vigilant on the GAPS diet. I've also seen a lot of failures, don't get me wrong. But I mean, I think all of these medical healing diets have efficacy and benefit for people to follow them for a season or for a time. But as a rule, most of them are unsustainable long-term.
Oh, I love that you brought up GAPS. And it brings me back to thinking, because this happened the first year I graduated, opened my own practice with my husband, mm-hmm. pediatric certified chiropractic. So I saw tons of kids, and this mom comes in and goes, "We're following the GAPS diet. What do you think?" And I was like, I don't know what I think about that. Let me look. And I
Mhm.
was like, I don't even understand this. How in the hell are you following this diet? Because it's like, you do this and then you got to go back to here and then you got to come up to here. And I'm like, what in the world? So it's interesting when you overcomplicate things, you're actually not necessarily going to move yourself forward any quicker.
Correct.
So, what I tell people when they ask me, what do I eat? Vegetables and protein, some fruit when it's in season and local.
Hmm. Yep.
And they'll go, well, what do you eat out? Vegetables and protein, like there's so many options out there, guys. You don't have to have that bowl of pasta or that bread. You can do everything minus that. And it's actually very flavorful. And truthfully, what I've had heard over and over again is following this allows me to try things that I wouldn't have tried before. And it's really good.
Hmm. Absolutely. And people comment on that all the time. Like I was at an Italian restaurant, everybody ordered pasta. I ordered chicken piccata over Brussels sprouts. So the woman sitting across the table from me says, "You can do that?" I was like, "Yeah, it's a restaurant." I watch them cook it. It's one of those like little mom and pop shops. I was like, I watch them cook all my food all the time. They can very easily steam the Brussels sprouts and put them underneath my chicken. She was like, "Oh." People don't, and I think that's part of the problem is people don't think that that's even an option. And I think that's part of all of this, particularly with women, is that you have to really understand your power and you have to understand your ability to heal yourself. And I think that is far more important than your body's ability to methylate.
I'd like to go back again. I
Yeah.
keep taking it back because I'm like, oh man, I didn't bring up my question on forgiveness, because I love that you brought that up.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness isn't really for the other person. It's not for them whatsoever. It's for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's the hardest thing to do, though.
Oh.
Why is forgiveness so hard? And what are some steps that you recommend women to help them practice forgiveness, or to, get over whatever it was that has really scarred and injured them?
So I think part of it is you have to have kindness. You have to treat yourself with the level of kindness that you treat your children. Most of us are moms and we would be patient all day with our kids. And I see that a lot in my practice. A mom will come in who will be half dead herself, but her kid has a hangnail, and that is the first priority. And I always say to them, you can't pour from an empty cup. And even the FAA says you put your oxygen mask on first, because if you go down, and I tell my family this all the time, all y'all are going down. And so, I think that's part of it. Kindness is part of it. Why is forgiveness so hard? It's because I think we live in this world that we don't have the time and the space for sickness. We don't have the time and the space for recovery. There are employers that expect you to birth a human and come back to work in 6 weeks. It takes you 9 months to grow said human, but you have 6 weeks as a recovery period. Some of the stuff that we do on this planet makes no physiologic sense whatsoever. So I think when you're a type A person, you have, a job that has a lot of stress, you're used to functioning in a stressful environment, it's easy to kind of push that away and say, I'll make a better decision in the future, instead of forgiving yourself for the bad decision you make in the past. And for me, I always recommend that you have, I read the Bible a lot, so that's really important to me, but I always recommend to my patients that you have a mantra, and whatever that mantra is, like, I forgive myself for what I didn't know, or, I'm going to be stronger next time. I'm going to know better, so I'm going to do better. And whatever the decisions are that you need to make going forward are the things that will help you in your life going forward. And I think that helps with forgiveness. I do tell my patients to journal, but I don't journal. I'm terrible at it. But that can be very helpful.
It's crazy. Why do we get away from the things that are so beneficial? Like, there'll be things that come up, and I, drop my meditation practice, and then I'm like, what am I doing? Like, that was one of the most beneficial things that I could do for myself, because that's one of the things that really helps me for self-forgiveness and self-reflection, is through that meditative practice. And when I don't do that, I turn into somebody that I don't like, that I'm like, I'm not kind to other people that I love. And it's like, why do I do that? That makes no sense. So getting into a habit, ladies, and if you fall off the program, like, that's okay. Just get back on. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know what to do, and give yourself the space to forgive yourself for falling off the program.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's absolutely wonderful. And then what was the higher power.
Mm-hmm.
So connecting to a higher power, whatever that higher power may be for you. Why
Mm-hmm.
is that so important?
Well, because I think it allows you to see yourself outside of yourself, number one. It gives you faith. And I mean, faith, especially in the time that we're currently living in, allows us to kind of trust that something better will be on the other side of it. And I think, I mean, we've seen all the statistics, even with coronavirus. I mean, the amount of suicides have already eclipsed the number of coronavirus deaths. People are really suffering. And so if you connect with your higher power, you have faith, whatever that higher power is. And that faith can help fill in the gaps when you don't have answers, when you can't tell your kids what the heck is going to happen tomorrow, or what the world is going to look like for them when they're the age that you are now. And I think that is so important because, you know, as a Christian, it's very easy to say that you can cast your fears off onto Jesus. And in other religions, it's a very similar thing. And so when you can give those fears and those anxieties to somebody else, it reduces your burden.
Mm-hmm. I love controlling the things you can control and releasing those that you cannot. There's a beautiful passage, and it's like, give me the strength to change the things that I can, the courage to understand the difference. Like, it's that passage, and I'm totally butchering it, but it's a beautiful passage. And I think, you know, we should all practice that. Instead of focusing on the things that we can't control, focus on those that we can.
Mm-hmm.
What are some last closing things before I ask you some fun questions, Dr. Kendra, about you, that you want to impart on the Women in Wellness Tribe when it comes to methylation?
So when it comes to methylation, I always say, you know, start simple. I love supplements. I am a self-professed supplement snob, but I really think just kind of cleaning your clock, so to speak, helps a lot more. So turn off your Wi-Fi at night, you know, disconnect your Bluetooth from the car, sweat several times a week. And those are things that can absolutely help with your methylation. Those are all avenues of detox. Those are all healthy, biologically normal things that our bodies know how to do in order to eliminate toxins. Now, you can get super fancy and talk about B vitamins or adding minerals or taking Epsom salt baths, but it's never ever a one size fits all approach. So we clean up the diet, we clean up our environment, and we're more than halfway there.
There you go. And that's what I tell people, is I use supplements as a means to expedite the process, not as a means to fix all of the bad habits that we have, because we can't do that through supplements. We have to make the lifestyle changes if we want the supplements to really, really work. So, all right, I like to ask a few fun questions. Don't think too hard about them. What is your favorite beverage?
Water? No. Okay. I know what my favorite beverage is. There is this company that makes seltzer that's flavored, and it's called Spindrift. And the one that I like has pure lemon juice in it and iced tea. And my husband makes fun of me because there's actually, I'm caffeine sensitive and there's caffeine in there, but it's absolutely delicious. It's unflavored. It's 5 calories, but you get just enough of the lemon and the iced tea flavor to really feel like you're on a golf course somewhere. It's perfect.
Oh, that sounds yummy. I haven't heard of that one.
Yep.
What is your favorite all-time meal? Like, if you knew you were only getting one meal left, what would that meal be?
Lobster and steamers.
Steamers like crabs? Or
steamers like, I'm from New England, so steamers like steamed clams.
Okay. Yep. I was like, I said club, but that wasn't.
Yeah.
Okay. And now you live in Florida.
Yes.
Don't know that you'll be getting the same type of clams in Florida, but that's okay.
I won't, but I can fly back. Well, I'm in Connecticut once a month anyway for my practice, so I can certainly do it up there.
There you go. What is on your bedside night table?
A Bible, a bottle of water, and we're renovating our house. So right now I have all kinds of specs on appliances. But I'm an anti-clutter kind of person, so generally there's not much on there at all.
Well, renovations, everything goes out the window. Very little control when you're doing that.
Indeed.
And then last question, what is your pick me up go-to song that gets you motivated and ready to go?
Oh, well, I would tell you so it's Paparazzi by Lady Gaga, but my daughter hates Lady Gaga, so I think I'd have to pick a Pitbull song. So I'll pick, which one do I like? I'll pick Timber.
Okay. That's funny how kids dictate your new favorite music, huh?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, thank you for being with me. Can you please tell my listeners where they can find you if they have questions, if they want to follow you, find out more about you and what you do? Where's the best place that they can find you?
Sure. I have a website, drkendrabecker.com. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Kendra Becker, and I'm on Facebook, but Facebook hates me at Dr. Kendra Becker. My account is always being warned and flagged. So I have a decent following on Facebook, but I don't know how many people see it. So if you want to follow me there, follow me there. There's a lot of great information about healing, wellness, and my own personal snarky opinions on things. So, but Facebook doesn't let a lot of people see it, unfortunately.
You know, I've stopped doing Facebook for that reason.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of things that just weren't getting through, that they didn't like what I was saying.
Yeah.
But that's okay. We're all allowed our own opinions.
Exactly right.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being with me. I truly appreciate it. And you've given a wealth of knowledge on a complicated subject that you made very simple. So thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Women in Wellness as much as I did. If you did, please leave a review and a rating so that others can also benefit from the information being shared. Make sure to subscribe as new content is released on Women in Wellness Wednesdays. And if you want to connect with us, go online to womeninwellness.com. That's women, the letter N, wellness.com. I look forward to seeing you next time.